Today, you're going to learn how to become a front-end developer in 2019. Oh, and hey, I'd like to mention this video's sponsor, Skillshare.com. Now, it's a brand new year here in 2019, and Skillshare will help keep you learning and thriving as they offer 25,000 different classes in coding, design, business, and more. For instance, you're about to watch my video on front-end development, but after, you could watch this course along with many others at Skillshare. Skillshare is also super affordable with a subscription that only costs $10 a month, but if you're one of the first 500 of my subscribers to click the link below here in the description, you get the first 2 months free. So take advantage. Hey everyone, Gary Simon of Coursetro. Welcome to 2019, as if I'm the mayor of 2019. Anyhow, I have big plans for this channel going forward in the future, so make sure you subscribe if you haven't yet. But I wanted to do a big topic-based video for 2019, which is becoming a front-end developer in 2019. Now, I consider myself a full-stack developer, but lately in the last year or so, I've been really focusing on front-end stuff. So I figured we would do this video. And I decided, okay, if somebody came to me who had computer experience, just basic computer experience, which is a prerequisite for this video, you should be able to know what the internet is and all that stuff. And they came to me and they said, hey, Gary, I'm going to become a front-end developer. What should I do? This is basically the approach that I've kind of outlined a blueprint for making this a reality for your life if you want to become a front-end dev. All right, so you can notice it also says a 5-step approach. All right, so I also made these 5 steps, and we're going to talk about each one of them. And I made them in the idea that they're going to be in sequential order. So you're going to start with step 1 and you're going to end with step 5. All right, which leads us to the next question you might have: must I follow this order? And the answer to that, of course, is no, but it might make your life easier. So for instance, step 2 is learning how to design user interfaces in different software and learning how to mock them up and prototype them. Does it make sense to do that before first understanding what step 1 is, which is understanding basic design fundamentals? No, not really. And I've seen it when I do my live design reviews, which I do every 2 weeks on Fridays. People, I could clearly see they don't understand basic design fundamentals, and it really shows in their work. All right, so and a couple of the other steps, it's completely fine to learn HTML and CSS maybe while you're designing user interfaces for the first time. But for the most part, try to stick to this template. So let's start off with the very first step, which is design fundamentals. All right, so design fundamentals, or understanding basic design principles, is not specific or unique to just UI design or front-end developers and designing apps and websites. Really, it's an all-encompassing principles and guidelines that apply to identity and logo design, to poster design, print design, packaging design, etc. And so we're going to talk about some of these right now. But first, understanding these design fundamentals is really important because there's some front-end developers who maybe might be great at HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, but they're not great at design. But if you really wanted to be a well-rounded front-end developer who can handle both of these aspects, then understanding these following points is going to be very important. And don't worry, it doesn't take like months to learn them. I mean, you could sit down, read a book about them, go on Google, read about these different design principles and fundamentals, and at least have a solid grasp at it from a conceptual level. And then it does take work to apply and make them muscle memory. So the first one, and these are not in any type of sequential order. The first one is color and contrast. Basically, when it comes to choosing colors and making sure your contrast is correct on your UI designs is very, very important. When I do my live design reviews, live streams, I see a lot of people who get contrast wrong, especially when they're working with typography. Depending on the background that type is sitting on, does it contrast enough? There's a great plugin that I use often called Contrast with a K that you can use to help you make sure that your contrast is up to par. But understanding color and contrast and using correct color combinations is very important. Next up is white space. So if we see on this slide right here, we'll see that we have design fundamentals, this type here, and we have step 1, and it seems to be sort of encased in what is negative or white space, as it's called, and it really helps to frame the important elements of your design quite a bit. So using this padding and these margins and white space essentially, and knowing how to use them is really important. Next up is visual hierarchy. For instance, we have step 1 up here, and notice it's a lot smaller. I've also made it all caps lock, and then we have this huge design fundamentals. That's because I've placed priority over these 2 different elements of this design, and I've emphasized them by scale, and I also caps lock this. So creating visual separation between the different areas on your design is so important, and that is visual hierarchy in a sense. And of course, you're going to want to research each of these topics on your own. Also, understanding complexity versus simplicity. Again, when I go back to these live streams, there's a lot of new designers who will add drop shadows, strokes, outer glows, in all these unnecessary elements simply because they have them and they know how to use them technically. But usually, more often than not, being simple is a lot more effective than being complex. So understanding that dynamic also very important. And then consistency. Understanding consistency is very important. Accurately or consistently using the same type in the same pattern of sense, the same colors, the same general design aesthetic that you're using or that you're going for to elicit certain emotions is very important as well. One that I didn't include here is also scale. Understanding scale, especially as it pertains to type, is very important. A lot of people might make some type real small just because they like that look, but again, it's not very user-friendly or effective. All right, so understanding these design fundamentals is very important. And of course, go to Google and type in design fundamentals tutorial or lessons or guides or book. I'll try to put some resources in the description below. Is really going to help you before you start to jump into the next step. So step 2, after you understand these basic design fundamentals, then you can try to learn how to apply them by designing and prototyping your user interfaces, be that for web pages or apps or whatever. And before we talk about which different software options that you have available, it's very important that you understand that you should learn how to design before you code. Now that's going to be step 3, which is learning HTML, CSS, etc. And that's because I notice there's some front-end developers, like I mentioned before, who might be great at HTML, CSS, etc. But in terms of being able to design things from scratch, they're not great at. And that's because they haven't really spent the time in these different design and mock-up / prototyping apps to really learn how to design things from scratch. Because when you try to skip this necessary step of creating a mock-up to showcase exactly what, how you want it to look like and how you want it to work, which is the case of prototyping, you only have a rough idea in your mind. So when you start typing out your HTML, CSS, and perhaps you're presenting it to a client and they say, I don't like this, that, and that, well, you're going to have a lot of work, obviously, to change your code. And that's why you want to go first back into one of these prototyping and design tools. In that way, it's much easier to change things around, and it makes your life much easier as well, just because you're able to visualize right in front of you exactly what you want to design. All right, so let's talk about these actual software applications. Now, before I begin, when I started in the late 90s, we used Adobe Photoshop for UI design and creating mockups, and I used it for a long time, after 2010 even, and some people still choose to use it just because they're old school, but what happened eventually is we had Sketch, which released, or it's called Sketch app, which is just for Mac only, and it really made a lot of people shift away from Photoshop and into this app because it was designed specifically for UI design. Photoshop is a Swiss Army knife, and it's just bogged down with so many different features that aren't really pertinent to UI design. So after Sketch released, we saw a ton of competitors prop up in 2017 and 2018. And these are some of the competitors that you have the option of choosing. So Adobe XD, or Experience Design, released as a beta about 2 years ago, and they've really done a great job in 2018 of really bringing it up to par with a ton of different features, which are awesome. It's what I personally use, and I've taught a bunch of Adobe XD tutorials. So just go to my channel, go to search, and just type in Adobe XD, and you're going to see, I don't know, 10 to 20 different tutorials on how to use it. There's also, for the next one, is Figma. And Figma is a very popular alternative as well. It's in browser, and it has a lot of interesting features that you can use. And all of these software, you know, just feel free to check them out on your own and experiment and learn more about them. Next is InVision app. There's also Gravit Designer, there's Framer, there's one called Principle. There's a bunch of them, and I'm probably forgetting and leaving out a bunch of the others. But really, when it comes to the 3 big UI design and prototyping tools, you have Sketch, you have Adobe XD, and you have Figma, which I would say are probably the most popular, and there's still more coming out. In fact, there's one that's in beta that's really going to change things up quite a bit, but I'm not going to mention that right now. All right, so after you understand how, you know, step 1, you understand your design fundamentals, and then you understand step 2, you start working within these design and prototype tools to apply what you learned in step 1 to create UI designs that look really good. And by the way, a little pro tip for that is check out the UI design inspiration / galleries that exist. There's a bunch of them, and you can gain ideas and see how professional designers and front-end developers and designers are applying these basic design fundamentals to really make an all-encompassing, really professional end result. All right, so for step 3, we have HTML and CSS. And before I begin about talking about, you know, which you should learn first and what they are exactly, you should understand the different code editors that you have that you can use, because in HTML and CSS you have to write it out and type it out. Essentially, it's not something like it's like a tool of some sort. So you want to have a code editor. Now, in the very early days, back in like as early as mid 90s, as far as I can remember, people just used Notepad from Windows, just a simple Notepad editor. It didn't really have, wasn't built for writing code, but that's what people used. And there's still some people today who use it as well. But there's a lot of different code editors that have come out, obviously, since then. There's Atom, there's Notepad++, there's Dreamweaver, which is from Adobe. But there's 2 that I recommend that a lot of people use. And the one that I use the most, along with many other people, is Visual Studio Code. It's free, and it's from Microsoft. It has a ton of plugins. It's very powerful. And there's also Sublime Text, which I used before switching to Visual Studio Code. All right, so for most of you, if you just download Visual Studio Code, you're going to be ready to go for learning HTML, which is the next process. So I wouldn't learn CSS first. I would definitely learn HTML. And understanding HTML is simply an acronym for Hypertext Markup Language. Next, HTML structures web pages, essentially. All the different elements that you might see on a web page, from the text elements, different blocks of text, to form fields and many other aspects. It's all structured with HTML elements and the individual building blocks of a web page. It's the easiest way to say it. And this right here is one of those such building blocks, essentially, called the head tag. And there are many tags. And this isn't going to be an HTML tutorial. So again, this is going to be one of those things, you know, when you get to this point, you go to Google, you go to YouTube and type in free HTML tutorial, or go to Udemy or something, or one of the many different education networks for learning HTML. And HTML5 is essentially what people are learning these days. Next up after that would be CSS. So CSS is an acronym for Cascading Style Sheets, and it sounds really strange, but all it really is, if you think about it, HTML is the skeleton and CSS is the flesh. It's what you see. All right, so CSS will take those ugly HTML elements, which are just have default styling, which the browser puts onto them, but it gives it structure and it makes it look 1,000 times better. So like I said, it allows you to style those HTML elements, and it contains selectors, properties, and values. And that's basically it. So if you learn HTML and CSS, you can then move on to SAS. All right, so SAS is an acronym for syntactically awesome style sheets. All right, and it's a preprocessor that enhances the power of CSS. So first, you might be wondering, what is a preprocessor? Well, when you're writing straight up CSS, you're working within CSS itself, and you're confined to the CSS specs and how what you can do with it. A preprocessor is something that will allow you to write CSS, for instance, with different features that it doesn't yet have. And then when you make a file save or you save it, depending on how you're integrating your SAS, it will output a regular CSS file for you. And the purpose of a preprocessor like SAS is to enhance the functionality and the feature set of CSS itself. So you can do things in SAS that you can't in CSS. All right, so that's hugely important. I wouldn't say it's more important than learning HTML and CSS, but once you get to the point of HTML and CSS, I would say you definitely want to learn SAS at least. There's also other ones called Less and Stylus and Compass. You can check those out as well, but SAS is the most important. So next up here is JavaScript. And JavaScript is a massive subject, and I want you to think of it as kind of the third layer of front-end development. First, you have your HTML. You have your CSS, which styles the HTML elements, and then you have JavaScript. And JavaScript is a scripting language for enhancing web pages. That's like the simplest definition that I could find. And it allows you to dynamically update content, animate elements, control multimedia, and much, much, much more. So there are a ton of different JavaScript tutorials and courses for beginners, and really I recommend taking multiple beginner courses so that you can really solidify what exactly JavaScript is. And once you go from understanding the basic concepts, go to the intermediate level as well, especially before proceeding to step 5. And this will really provide you with a solid grounding and understanding of JavaScript itself. Do you have to get into the very advanced level stuff? Well, in an ideal world, it would be nice if you did, but you don't necessarily have to. If you just get to the basic beginner slash to the inner, and ideally an intermediate level, you'll be fine to proceed to the next step, which is JavaScript frameworks and libraries. Now, these frameworks and libraries are useful for creating more complex web apps. So for instance, if you tried creating an app, say like Discord, it's very popular. Most of you probably know it. It's basically an in-browser chat application with just pure vanilla JavaScript. And vanilla JavaScript is just straight up JavaScript with no bells and whistles like frameworks and libraries added. It would be very, very difficult on multiple fronts. So this is where JavaScript frameworks or libraries come into place that can really help you create these more complex web apps. For instance, Discord, the front end is built with both something called Electron, as I mentioned before, and React and Flux. So when it comes to the usefulness of these JavaScript front-end frameworks that I'm going to outline in a second, they're useful for building these single-page applications. They're component-based. They have strong communities because they're very popular, and they also handle state management, which is for handling data. And trying to handle data and also represent it in a user interface with just straight up pure vanilla JavaScript is very difficult. And these different frameworks and libraries help solve that problem. All right, so some of them, I'm just going to mention the 3 most popular. So the most popular is React, and it's created by Facebook, and they made it publicly available for others to use, and it's basically one of the first to come out that does what it does in terms of being a JavaScript library. Tons of people like it. It is the most popular and currently in the most demand. Me personally, I don't have a ton of experience in React. I have more experience in both Angular and Vue, and those are the other two. Angular is made by Google. It is very powerful. It's more considered a framework. It's definitely more robust, whereas React is considered to be a library, which is more plug and play. And there's also Vue, and Vue is gaining popularity. I personally like it a lot. Now, don't just take my word for it. Of course, that's just an anecdotal, subjective preference, essentially. What you should really do is try all three. There are also comparison courses that are put out. I think I put out one about 2 years ago. That might be a little bit outdated though. So definitely what would be most ideal is to follow beginner level to introduction projects to each of the three, and then you'll basically choose which one that you personally feel the most comfortable with. In each of the three are more than capable of solving and tackling pretty much any complex project that you might have in terms of development. All right, so to conclude, the very first thing I think it makes most sense to start with is learning design fundamentals. Again, that's understanding the color and contrast, scale, consistency, visual hierarchy, etc. And then once you understand these basic concepts and how they're applied to user interface design, then you want to learn how to actually apply them and how to design effective user interfaces and also prototype them. Depending on which tool you use, for instance, Adobe Experience Design, it's set up in 2 different tabs where you can design and then you can prototype, which means you can add functionality to them and add animations and just to showcase how it should look in the browser or different devices. After you understand and you're able to design well, then it's time to make it a reality in the browser or the device, and that comes with HTML and CSS. First learn your HTML and then learn how to style those HTML elements with CSS. And then also, if you want, which I think would be an added bonus, definitely learn Sass as well. And then you can step into the world of JavaScript. And again, the JavaScript is a massive topic that can do many things that I think is in this day and age a requirement if you want to be an in-demand and effective front-end developer. After at that point, you can also then begin to experiment in developing preferences for the various front-end frameworks or libraries that exist out there. If you don't understand JavaScript at a fundamental level first, and you try to jump straight into something like React or Angular or Vue, you're going to have a hard time because then you're adding, trying to understand how these different frameworks work, plus how JavaScript itself works, and it's very difficult. Definitely start with JavaScript first, and then you could start to experiment with one of the big three frameworks / libraries that exist out there. All right, so hopefully you enjoyed this, and of course I do know I left out a lot of different other topics in other technologies, but these are the ones that I feel are most important to focus on in 2019, and the other things that you may want to learn will come along just as a matter of necessity. For instance, understanding different build tools, understanding how to use GitHub repositories, and all of that good stuff. But again, for a newcomer, this process can be very challenging. So I wanted to keep it as simple as possible. If you guys have other suggestions, go ahead and leave it in the comments and let me know what you think. So if you enjoyed this and you definitely want to learn this stuff, because I do cover this stuff, make sure you subscribe here, click the notification bell icon, and I'll see you guys real soon. Goodbye.